It was a peaceful afternoon at Franklin Park. The air was crisp, the kind that made you feel alive without chilling you to the bone. The sun hung lazily in the sky, its golden rays weaving through the swaying branches of tall oaks and maples. Birds chirped their carefree melodies while children's laughter echoed across the playground. Joggers moved rhythmically along the winding paths, their sneakers pattering lightly against the pavement. Dogs barked playfully, tugging at leashes as their owners tried to keep up. The world seemed calm, perfect, like the kind of scene captured in postcards and family albums. Amid all this liveliness, a gray-haired man sat alone on a wooden bench near the park's pond. His name was James MacArthur, though most people around these parts only knew him as Mac. He wasn't the kind of man who sought attention. His presence was quiet, almost forgettable. Clad in an old leather jacket, worn jeans, and scuffed boots, he blended into the scenery, just another face in the crowd. His face, weathered by time, told a story if you cared to look closely, a story of hardship, resilience, and battles fought, though not many did. Most didn't even notice him. Mac's hands rested on his lap, fingers interlocked as he gazed at the pond. Ducks floated lazily across the still water, occasionally dipping their heads beneath the surface. The faint rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed to harmonize with the distant chatter of park-goers. To the casual observer, Mac appeared to be just another retiree passing time, someone with nowhere to be and nothing to do. His aviator sunglasses hid his eyes, making it even harder to read him. But Mac wasn't like everyone else. For those who paid attention, which wasn't many, there was something unusual about him. It wasn't just his posture, though that alone set him apart. He sat straight-backed, shoulders squared, as if he were still waiting for an officer to shout an order. Most men his age slouched or leaned heavily against benches, giving in to gravity's pull. Not Mac. He sat upright, unmoving, like a statue carved from stone. And then there were his hands, strong and calloused, with faint scars crisscrossing the knuckles and palms. They weren't the hands of someone who had spent his life behind a desk. They were hands that had worked, fought, endured. The kind of hands that told you their owner had been through things most people couldn't imagine. But Mac kept those stories to himself. He was polite to anyone who spoke to him. Sometimes it was a curious child asking about the patches on his jacket, other times a jogger nodding in greeting, but he rarely said more than a few words. His voice, deep and gravelly, carried the weight of someone who had seen and done far too much. Despite his reserved nature, there was a warmth in the way he waved at passing toddlers or smiled faintly at couples walking hand in hand. He wasn't unfriendly, just distant, as if he lived in a world slightly apart from everyone else. Most of the regulars at Franklin Park had seen Mac before. He showed up often, usually in the afternoons, and always sat on the same bench by the pond. They assumed he was just another retiree with too much time on his hands. Maybe he was widowed, they thought, or estranged from his family. Some speculated that he used to be a mechanic because of his rough hands. Others guessed he was a truck driver or a construction worker. No one really knew the truth. If they had, they might have kept their distance. Mac had spent decades in the army, serving in some of the most dangerous conflicts of his time. He was a ranger, part of an elite group trained to handle missions that others couldn't. His life had been anything but ordinary. He'd seen combat up close, lost friends in the line of duty, and carried memories that haunted him at night. But he wasn't the type to talk about it. To Mac, those years were part of a different life, a life he didn't like to revisit unless absolutely necessary. He wasn't one to boast or share war stories at the local diner. He didn't wear his medals or talk about the places he'd been. Instead, he preferred to fade into the background, content to let the world move on without him. But despite his desire for peace, the instincts he'd honed over decades never left him. He still scanned his surroundings out of habit, noting who entered and exited the park, how they moved, and where their attention was focused. His body, though older, still carried the muscle memory of a soldier. Even sitting on that bench, Mac was far from unprepared. Beneath his leather jacket, he carried a small tactical knife strapped to his side just in case. His cane, which most people assumed was for support, was actually a custom-made tactical staff, reinforced for self-defense. And while he hadn't fired a weapon in years, his aim was as sharp as ever. Mac didn't expect trouble in a place like Franklin Park, but he wasn't the type to take chances. What people saw was an old man enjoying a quiet afternoon. What they didn't see was a man who had spent his entire life preparing for the unexpected. Mac took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds around him: the laughter of children, the barking of dogs, the rustle of leaves. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sliver of peace. It wasn't something he allowed himself often, but here, in the simplicity of the park, it felt okay to let his guard down just a little. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old pocket watch, its silver surface scratched and tarnished. Flipping it open, he smiled faintly at the photograph inside: a younger version of himself standing beside a woman with bright eyes and a radiant smile. His late wife, Eleanor. She'd been gone for over a decade, but he still carried her memory with him wherever he went. As Max stared at the photograph, he felt a pang of longing, a quiet ache that never truly went away. But he quickly closed the watch and slipped it back into his pocket. Life didn't allow him the luxury of dwelling on the past for too long. The sound of motorcycle engines in the distance pulled him out of his thoughts. He glanced up, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly behind his sunglasses. The low rumble grew louder, more distinct, as a group of bikers entered the park. 5 of them, riding in a loose formation, their leather jackets bearing the emblem of a flaming skull. Mac didn't react immediately. He simply observed, his body still, his mind alert. He'd seen groups like this before: loud, brash, and looking for trouble. He hoped they would pass through without incident, but deep down, he knew better. The bikers parked near the playground, their engines cutting off one by one. The sudden silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. Parents pulled their children closer, and joggers hurried past without looking back. The group dismounted, laughing and talking loudly, their presence commanding attention whether people wanted to give it or not. Mac watched them from his bench, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but inside, his mind was already working. Trouble had arrived at Franklin Park. And Trouble didn't realize who it was about to meet. Mac remained seated, calm and still, as the bikers strutted around the park like wolves in a field of sheep. Their laughter was loud, coarse, and carried the kind of arrogance that made people uneasy. They had the look of men who enjoyed being feared, who fed off the discomfort of others. The leader was a burly man with a shaved head and a snake tattoo coiling up the side of his neck. His leather jacket hung open, revealing a stained t-shirt underneath. He carried himself with an air of authority, barking orders at the others while flashing a grin that was more menacing than friendly. His companions were no less intimidating, each of them sporting scars, tattoos, and a roughness that told you they weren't strangers to trouble. They walked into the park like they owned it, kicking over a trash can here, scattering a group of pigeons there. It wasn't outright violence, but it was enough to set the tone: we're in charge now. Mac kept watching, his face unreadable. He didn't move, didn't fidget. His breathing remained steady, slow, as if he were part of the bench itself. A casual observer might have thought he was completely uninterested in the commotion, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. Behind his sunglasses, Mac's sharp eyes took in every detail. He noted the way the leader favored his left side, as if he had an old injury. He saw the smallest of twitches in one biker's hand as he adjusted the chain on his belt, a habit of someone used to reaching for a weapon. Most of all, Mac paid attention to their voices. Loud and brash as they were, they revealed more than the bikers probably intended. "This place is too quiet," the leader said, sneering as he scanned the park. No action here. Boring as hell. Should have gone to the strip downtown, one of his men muttered, kicking at a pile of fallen leaves. Nah, the leader shot back. We'll make our own fun. Who's gonna stop us? These people? Look at 'em. He waved his hand dismissively at the families hurriedly gathering their belongings and moving toward the parking lot. They can't wait to run home to their little cookie-cutter lives? No fight in 'em. Another man chuckled. Yeah. Not like they'd even try to stand up to us. Mac's lips twitched ever so slightly, the ghost of a smirk threatening to appear. He'd heard this kind of talk before, back in his younger days. Men who ran their mouths too much. Men who mistook volume for strength. He'd dealt with their kind before, and the results had always been the same. But Mac wasn't one to act recklessly. He knew better than to engage unless absolutely necessary. As the bikers continued their loud conversation, the park slowly began to empty. Parents with young children packed up their picnic blankets. Dog walkers changed course to avoid crossing paths with the newcomers. Even the joggers seemed to quicken their pace, their heads down as they passed. The bikers noticed, of course they wanted to be noticed. See that, the leader said, grinning as a young mother hurried away, clutching her toddler's hand. They know what's up. One look at us, and they're gone. They're scared of us, another biker added, puffing out his chest. Damn right, they are. The leader slapped one of his men on the back. That's what we bring, boys. Fear. Respect. From his bench, Mac heard every word. He resisted the urge to shake his head. These weren't men looking for respect, they were bullies, plain and simple. The kind of people who thought strength came from intimidating others. Mac had seen it before, too many times to count. And he knew how it usually ended for people like them. Still, he didn't move. Not yet. One of the bikers, a lanky man with a scruffy beard, pointed toward the pond. Hey, check it out. Old man over there hasn't moved an inch. Think he's deaf or something. Mac's hand tightened slightly around his cane, but he said nothing. He remained as still as ever, his breathing slow and deliberate. Nah, the leader said, cracking his knuckles. He's just dumb. Probably doesn't even know what's going on. He started walking toward Mac, the others following close behind. Their boots crunched against the gravel path as they closed the distance. Mac knew they were coming for him. He could feel it in the way the air shifted, in the way their laughter grew quieter, more focused. It was the same feeling he used to get before a mission, that sense of tension coiling tighter with every passing second. But Mac didn't move. He didn't even turn his head. The leader stopped a few feet away from the bench, his hands on his hips. Hey, Grandpa, he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. You lost or something? This ain't a retirement home. The others snickered, their laughter echoing across the park. Mac said nothing. What's the matter? The leader continued, stepping closer. Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you don't speak English. Need me to spell it out for you? Still, Mac didn't respond. He simply sat there, his hands resting on his cane, his face calm and expressionless. The leader's grin faltered slightly, his bravado dented by the lack of reaction. Guess he's too old to understand, one of the bikers muttered. Or too stupid, another added, eliciting more laughter from the group. The leader leaned in, close enough for Mac to smell the cheap beer on his breath. You got a death wish, old man? He asked, his voice low and threatening. Mac finally moved, turning his head just enough to look up at the leader. Behind his sunglasses, his sharp eyes locked onto the man's face, unflinching. No, he said, his voice calm and measured. But you might. The leader blinked, caught off guard by the response. For a moment, the confidence in his swagger wavered. But then he laughed, a harsh, Barking sound. Oh, you've got jokes, huh? That's funny. Real funny. Mac didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He just looked at the man, his gaze steady and unyielding. The leader straightened up, gesturing to his men. All right, boys. Let's show Grandpa what happens when you run your mouth. The park, once filled with the sounds of laughing children and chirping birds, now bristled with tension. The Iron Talons, with their roaring motorcycles and over-the-top bravado, had turned a peaceful haven into a stage for intimidation. Their arrival was like a storm cloud rolling in, darkening the mood and sending families packing. Mac watched the scene unfold, his calm demeanor unshaken. He knew their type too well. Men who relied on bluster and numbers, who preyed on weakness and reveled in fear. But fear wasn't something Mac carried anymore. Not after everything he'd seen, everything he'd endured. The leader of the pack, the tattooed man with a thick neck and a chip on his shoulder, approached with heavy steps. His boots scraped against the gravel, loud and deliberate, like he wanted the world to know he was coming. He stopped just a few feet from Mac's bench, standing tall and looming. I said, "That's our bench," the leader repeated, his voice louder, harsher. The veins in his neck bulged as he pointed a thick finger at Mac. "You're deaf, old man? Or just dumb?" The other bikers spread out behind him, their leather jackets creaking as they moved. One of them flicked a cigarette onto the ground, the glowing ember bouncing near Mac's feet. Another cracked his knuckles, a cruel grin playing across his face. They were a pack now, circling their prey, waiting for a sign from their leader to pounce. Mac's response was as deliberate as it was unexpected. He leaned back slightly, resting both hands on his cane, and tilted his head to look at the leader. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but the way his lips quirked up at the corners suggested something far from fear. "You want the bench," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Plenty of others around. This one's taken." The leader blinked, startled by the calm defiance. For a moment, the bravado faltered. Then, as if to cover the hesitation, he laughed a deep, mocking sound. "Oh, you've got some guts, huh? Must think you're funny." The group erupted into jeers and laughter, egged on by their leader. One of them, a wiry man with a crooked nose, stepped forward and spat on the ground near Mac's shoe. "I think Grandpa needs a reminder of who's in charge around here." The leader grinned, clearly enjoying the show. "That's right. Maybe we should give you a little lesson, huh? Teach you some respect." Mac didn't move. Didn't flinch. His fingers tapped lightly against the head of his cane, a barely noticeable rhythm. To the bikers, it probably looked like a nervous tic. But Mac wasn't nervous. He was measuring. Counting. His breathing stayed slow, steady, just like it always had in high-pressure situations. The kind of situations these loudmouths wouldn't last a second in. "Respect," Mac said, his voice soft but carrying an edge. He lifted his chin slightly, meeting the leader's gaze squarely. Funny coming from a man who thinks yelling and stomping around makes him important. The air seemed to shift. For a second, the bikers didn't laugh. The leader's grin faded into a snarl, and his eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Mac. "You've got a big mouth for an old man," he growled, stepping even closer. The tension thickened, drawing the attention of the few park-goers who hadn't fled. A jogger paused at the edge of the path, her eyes darting nervously between Mac and the gang. An older couple hesitated near the playground, clearly debating whether to intervene or call for help. But no one moved. No one dared to get involved. One of the bikers, a stocky man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned in toward the leader. "Let's just throw him off the bench already. Show him who's boss." The leader waved him off, holding up a hand. "Nah. I want him to say it. I want him to admit he's too scared to do anything. He smirked, crossing his arms. So, what's it gonna be, old man? You gonna tuck your tail and run? Or are you stupid enough to stay? Mac didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly pushed himself to his feet, using the cane for support. He wasn't a tall man, but something about the way he stood made him seem larger. He turned to face the leader fully, adjusting his stance. His leather jacket shifted, revealing the faint outline of a military patch on the sleeve, faded, but unmistakable. The leader noticed, his eyes flicking to the patch before returning to Mac's face. For the first time, a hint of uncertainty crept into his expression. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, his tone less confident now. Mac tilted his head slightly, as if considering his next words carefully. It means, he said slowly, I've dealt with tougher men than you. And I'm still here. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence wavering. But the leader wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. He laughed again, though the sound was more forced this time. Tougher men, huh? Let me guess. You were some big shot soldier back in the day? Is that what this is about? Mac didn't answer. He didn't need to. The way he stood, the way he carried himself, said more than words ever could. It wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. A quiet, unshakable confidence that came from experience. The leader's bravado cracked just a little more. He glanced back at his crew, as if seeking reassurance. Doesn't matter, he said quickly. You're still just an old man now. And old men break just the same. He took a step forward, his hand reaching out to shove Mac's shoulder. But before he could make contact, Mac's cane moved not fast, not aggressively, but with precision. He shifted it slightly, planting the tip against the ground in a way that blocked the leader's advance. It wasn't a shove. It wasn't even a hit. But it was enough to make the leader stop in his tracks. Enough to make him hesitate. You really don't want to do this, Mac said, his voice low but firm. There was no anger in it, no malice. Just a simple statement of fact. The leader froze for a moment, caught off guard. But then the anger returned, stronger than before. Oh, that's it, he growled, his hands balling into fists. You've got a death wish, don't you? Mac sighed softly, almost as if he were disappointed. No, he said, his tone calm. But you might. For a split second, the leader faltered. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Something in Mac's voice, something steady and unshakable, seemed to cut through the bravado. But then one of the other bikers, the wiry man with the crooked nose, stepped forward, sneering. Come on, boss. Let's just show him what happens when you mess with the Talons. The leader hesitated, then nodded sharply. Yeah. Let's do that. They closed in, their boots crunching against the gravel. Mac didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply tightened his grip on the cane and waited. The iron talons spread out around Mac like a pack of wolves circling prey, their grins twisted with malice. The tension in the air thickened, pressing down on anyone still brave enough to linger in the park. A few onlookers, hidden behind trees or standing at a distance, whispered among themselves. Some had their phones out, recording the scene, but no one stepped forward. It was clear they all thought this would end one way, with the old man on the ground. Mac remained rooted in place, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his grip on his cane, the subtle movement going unnoticed by most except maybe the leader. Something about the way Mac stood, calm and controlled, sent an uneasy ripple through the big man. But pride was a powerful force, and the leader wasn't about to back down in front of his crew. All right, old man, the leader sneered, cracking his knuckles. You had your chance. Now you're gonna learn what happens when you mess with us. The wiry one with the crooked nose moved first, eager to impress. "Let me handle this," he said, lunging toward Mac with a nasty grin. His movements were quick, sloppy with overconfidence. He reached out, aiming to grab Mac's collar, but what happened next froze everyone in their tracks. Mac sidestepped smoothly, shifting just enough to let the wiry man stumble past him. In the same motion, Mac lifted his cane not with force, but with precision, planting the hooked end firmly against the man's ankle. The biker's momentum did the rest. He tripped, arms flailing as he crashed to the ground in a cloud of gravel and curses. The park fell silent for a moment, the only sound the wiry man groaning as he pushed himself up on scraped elbows. The other bikers stared, their bravado faltering as they processed what they'd just seen. The leader's face twisted in anger, his pride stung. "What the hell was that?" he barked. "Get up, Slim." Slim, still on his hands and knees, muttered a string of expletives. "He tripped me. The old geezer tripped me." Mac tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "I warned you," he said, his tone mild, almost conversational. "You should have listened." The leader's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Lucky shot," he growled. "You're just an old man with a stick. Let's see how lucky you get against all of us." With a sharp gesture, he signaled the rest of the crew. The remaining bikers advanced, their earlier hesitation replaced by a renewed surge of aggression. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head and arms like tree trunks, cracked his neck as he moved forward. "I'll break that stick in half," he snarled. Mac's stance shifted slightly, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet. To the casual observer, it might have looked like nothing, but to anyone who knew how to fight, it was clear, Mac was ready. His cane, once a simple tool for walking, was now an extension of his body, held with the familiarity of someone who'd trained with far deadlier instruments. The burly man swung first, a wide, heavy arc aimed at Mac's chest. But Mac was faster, much faster than anyone expected. He stepped inside the swing, closing the distance in an instant. With a quick twist of his wrist, he brought the cane up, the polished wood striking the biker's wrist with pinpoint accuracy. The man yelped, his grip faltering as pain shot up his arm. Before he could recover, Mac shifted again, pivoting smoothly as he swept the cane low. The hooked end caught the back of the man's knee, and with a sharp tug, Mac sent him sprawling onto his back. The impact sent a thud through the air, followed by a groan as the burly man writhed on the ground. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence visibly wavering. They'd expected an easy target, a defenseless old man they could push around. Instead, they were facing someone who moved with the precision of a predator, someone who didn't waste a single motion. "Who's next?" Mac asked, his voice calm, almost bored. He planted the tip of his cane on the ground, standing tall as he surveyed the group. The leader's face was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, embarrassment, and something that looked suspiciously like fear. But he wasn't about to back down. Not in front of his crew. "Don't just stand there," he snapped at the remaining two bikers. "Get him." The two exchanged a glance, their earlier bravado crumbling. But loyalty, or perhaps fear of their leader, pushed them forward. They moved together this time, hoping to overwhelm Mac with numbers. One came at him from the left, the other from the right, their arms outstretched to grab him. Mac waited until the last possible moment, his body relaxed, his breathing steady. Then, with a fluid motion, he spun on his heel, his cane cutting through the air like a blade. The hooked end caught the first biker's wrist, twisting it sharply and forcing him to release his grip. At the same time, Mac shifted his weight, bringing his elbow up to meet the second biker's face. The impact was swift and precise, sending the man stumbling backward with a cry of pain. The first biker tried to recover, but Mac was already moving. He stepped forward, his cane sweeping low to knock the man's legs out from under him. The biker hit the ground hard, his breath leaving him in a wheezing gasp. By the time Mac straightened, the two bikers were on the ground, groaning and clutching at their injuries. The leader stood frozen, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. His crew, his invincible, untouchable crew, was scattered around the park, defeated by a single man. Mac turned to face him, his expression calm but unwavering. "Still think I'm just an old man?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. The leader's hands twitched at his sides, his fists clenching and unclenching as he struggled to process what had just happened. "You," he began, but the words caught in his throat. He took a step back, then another, his bravado crumbling with each movement. Mac took a single step forward, his cane tapping against the gravel. "You've got two choices," he said evenly. "You can leave now and take your friends with you. Or you can stay and see what happens next." The leader hesitated, his pride warring with his survival instincts. But the look in Mac's eyes, the calm certainty of someone who had nothing to prove and everything under control, made the decision for him. "Let's get out of here," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned on his heel, motioning for his crew to follow. Now, one by one, the bikers dragged themselves to their feet, limping and groaning as they stumbled toward their motorcycles. The leader was the last to leave, casting one final glance over his shoulder at Mac. But Mac had already turned away, lowering himself back onto the bench as if nothing had happened. The sound of engines roared to life, then faded into the distance as the iron talons fled the park. The tension that had gripped the air began to dissipate, replaced by a stunned silence. Slowly, the scattered onlookers emerged from their hiding places, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. Mac picked up his newspaper, unfolded it, and resumed reading as if nothing had happened. To him, it was just another day. To everyone else, it was a story they'd never forget. The air grew heavy as Mac's words hung there, unwavering. A flicker of unease passed through the bikers, though none would admit it. The leader barked a laugh, trying to shake the tension. "A mistake? Look at you. You're outnumbered, out of your league, and now, out of your cane." One of the bikers, a lanky man with a sneer permanently plastered across his face, examined the cane, twirling it in his hands like a trophy. "What's so special about this stick, huh? Think this makes you tough?" Mac turned, his face calm but his eyes like steel. "It's not the cane that makes a man strong. It's what he knows." The lanky biker snorted, tossing the cane to the ground. "Yeah? Well, we know you're about to regret showing up here." They closed in again, the circle tightening. A few families who had dared to stay and watch gasped softly, their fear palpable. But Mac wasn't like the others. He didn't run, didn't beg. Instead, he bent down, calmly picked up the cane, and dusted it off. His movements were deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. "You really don't get it, do you?" Mac said, standing straight again. "You think strength is about numbers, about intimidation." He gestured at the leader with the cane. You rely on fear because you don't know what real power looks like." The leader's face twisted in anger. "You've got a big mouth for a guy who's about to eat dirt." He nodded at the lanky biker. "Teach him some respect." Lanky smirked and stepped forward, cracking his knuckles theatrically. "All right, Grandpa. Let's see what you've got." He lunged, expecting an easy victory. But what followed was anything but. Mac didn't dodge wildly or flinch. Instead, he shifted just enough to avoid the blow, his movements fluid and precise. Before Lanky could recover, Mac struck. With a swift tap of the cane to the biker's wrist, the momentum of the punch collapsed, sending the man stumbling forward. Mac pivoted and used the cane's hook to catch the back of his opponent's knee. A quick pull, and Lanky crashed to the ground with a yelp. The others froze, the smug grins wiped from their faces. Lanky groaned, clutching his leg as he tried and failed to get up. The spectators murmured in astonishment, some pulling out their phones to capture what was quickly becoming an unforgettable scene. "Next?" Mac asked, his tone as calm as ever. He stood straight, the cane lightly tapping the ground beside him. There was no boasting, no mocking, just quiet confidence. The leader's eyes narrowed. "You got lucky," he muttered. Then, louder, "Let's all take him." The remaining 3 bikers moved in, splitting to attack from different angles. To them, it was a simple numbers game. But Mac saw something else entirely. He wasn't looking at their faces, he was reading their stances, their balance, the tension in their shoulders. He didn't just see men charging at him, he saw openings, weaknesses, and paths to exploit. The first biker came in low, aiming to tackle Mac's legs. Mac stepped back just in time, redirecting the man's momentum with a gentle shove of the cane. The biker tumbled past him, rolling awkwardly onto the ground. The second one, a stocky brute with arms like hams, swung a fist the size of a small boulder. Mac ducked and delivered a sharp jab to the man's rib cage with the cane. The stocky biker gasped, doubling over as the air rushed out of him. The third biker hesitated, clearly rethinking his choices. But it was too late. Mac closed the gap with surprising speed for a man his age. With a swift sweep of the cane, he knocked the biker's feet out from under him, sending him sprawling onto the gravel. Mac stood in the center of the chaos, untouched, while the bikers lay groaning around him. The leader's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were supposed to be the ones in control. "Who are you?" the leader spat, his bravado cracking. "You're not just some old man. What are you, a cop? Military?" Mac tilted his head slightly. "Does it matter?" he asked. "The only thing you need to know is that you're out of your depth." The leader gritted his teeth, pulling a knife from his belt. "You think you're so smart, huh? Let's see how tough you are when steel's involved." The onlookers gasped, and some shouted warnings. But Mac didn't flinch. He adjusted his grip on the cane, his movements as steady as ever. "Put it down," Mac said, his voice firm but calm. "You don't want to do this." The leader laughed bitterly. "Oh, I want to do this. I'm gonna teach you a lesson you'll never forget." He lunged, the blade flashing in the sunlight. For a moment, it seemed as though Mac was caught off guard. But in a blur of motion, he sidestepped and brought the cane up with precision. The hooked end caught the leader's wrist, twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, skidding out of reach. Mac didn't stop there. With a quick shift, he hooked the cane around the leader's ankle and pulled. The man fell hard, landing flat on his back with a grunt. Before he could recover, Mac planted the tip of the cane firmly on the leader's chest, pinning him in place. "Enough," Mac said, his voice low and commanding. "This isn't a fight you can win." The leader stared up at him, his chest heaving. For the first time, fear overtook the anger in his eyes. Who are you?" he asked again, his voice trembling. Mac leaned down slightly, his face inches from the leader's. "Just a man who doesn't like bullies," he said simply. He stepped back, removing the cane and allowing the leader to scramble to his feet. The other bikers, bruised and beaten, began to gather around him, their earlier arrogance replaced by humiliation. They glanced at Mac warily, as if afraid he might strike again. "Get out of here," Mac said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And don't come back." The leader hesitated, his pride clearly warring with his better judgment. But one look at Mac's steady gaze was enough to make up his mind. He turned to his crew. "Let's go." The bikers limped toward their motorcycles, muttering curses under their breath. As their engines roared to life and they sped off, the park erupted in applause. The families and onlookers who had watched in stunned silence now cheered and clapped, some shouting words of gratitude. Mac, however, didn't bask in the attention. He picked up his newspaper, folded it neatly, and tucked it under his arm. With a polite nod to the crowd, he began walking away, heading toward the far end of the park. As he passed by a young boy who had been watching wide-eyed, the child tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is he a superhero?" Mac paused, glancing back over his shoulder. He smiled faintly but said nothing, disappearing down the path as the whispers of admiration followed him. Mac walked away with measured strides, his back straight and his cane tapping softly against the ground. The crowd's murmurs and cheers slowly faded as he disappeared down the winding path that led deeper into the park. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. But Mac's calm demeanor masked the fire that was still burning within him. Back at the parking lot, the bikers regrouped, humiliated and furious. Their leader, Jack, known to his crew as Snake for his cunning and ruthless ways, paced around, rubbing his sore wrist. The sting of defeat wasn't just physical, it was personal. No one had ever made Snake look like a fool, let alone in front of his crew and a crowd of onlookers. "That old man," Snake growled, his voice low and venomous. "He's not what he seems." One of the bikers, a wiry guy nicknamed Razor, winced as he pressed an ice pack to his knee. "No kidding. Did you see how fast he moved? That wasn't normal." "He's gotta be ex-military or something," muttered Bruiser, the stockiest of the group, still cradling his ribs. "No regular old dude fights like that." Snake stopped pacing and glared at them. "I don't care what he is. Nobody embarrasses the Iron Talons and gets away with it. Nobody. What do we do now?" Razor asked hesitantly, clearly not eager for a second round with Mac. Snake's lips curled into a cold smirk. "We find out who he is. Where he lives. What he cares about. And then we make him regret messing with us." The rest of the gang exchanged uneasy glances but nodded. Snake was their leader, and his word was law. They climbed onto their bikes, the engines roaring back to life. Snake pulled out his phone, snapping a photo of Mac's retreating figure in the distance. "Let's pay a visit to a friend of mine," he said. "He's good at digging up dirt." Meanwhile, Mac reached the far side of the park, where a secluded grove of trees offered a quiet escape. He stopped by a small clearing and leaned against a sturdy oak, his cane resting at his side. He took a deep breath, letting the tension drain from his body. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a worn photograph. It showed a younger version of himself, dressed in full military gear, standing beside a small group of soldiers. Their faces were weathered but proud, their camaraderie evident. Mac's finger lingered over the image of a man standing next to him, a tall, broad-shouldered fellow with a mischievous grin. "Jameson," Mac murmured, his voice barely audible. "You'd laugh if you saw me now, wouldn't you?" The photo was a reminder of a time when life was simpler, even if it was harder. He had been part of something bigger then, something that gave him purpose. But that was a long time ago. Now, he lived a quieter life, one of solitude and reflection. Or so he had thought. Mac's peaceful moment was interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path behind him. He didn't turn around immediately, but his grip on the cane tightened slightly. "You were impressive back there," a voice said. It was deep but kind, with a tone that suggested experience and respect. Mac glanced over his shoulder to see a man in his late 40s approaching. He wore a crisp navy blue suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed. Everything about him screamed authority, though he moved with a disarming ease. "And you are?" Mac asked, his tone neutral but wary. The man stopped a few feet away, offering a small, professional smile. "Agent Carter. Department of Homeland Security. Retired now, but I still keep my ear to the ground." Mac raised an eyebrow. "Homeland Security? What would someone like you want with someone like me? Carter chuckled softly. I'm not here to drag you into anything, Mac. I just happened to be in the park today and saw what happened. Let's just say I have a knack for recognizing people who've seen more than their fair share of action. Mac's expression didn't change, but Carter noticed the subtle shift in his stance. It was the posture of a man deciding whether to fight or flee. You've got the wrong guy, Mac said simply. He slipped the photograph back into his pocket and started to walk away. Carter didn't follow, but his next words stopped Mac in his tracks. You served in the 5th Special Operations Group, didn't you? Gulf War veteran. Discharged with honors. Mac froze, his shoulders stiffening. Slowly, he turned back to face Carter. I don't know what you're talking about. Carter held up his hands, a gesture of peace. Relax, Mac. I'm not here to blow your cover or dig up your past. I just wanted to say, thank you. For what you did back there. The world needs more people like you. Mac studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of deceit. But Carter's expression was genuine, and after a long pause, Mac gave a small nod. Take care of yourself, Agent, Mac said, turning once more to leave. You too, Mac, Carter replied. But a word of advice, those bikers aren't going to let this go. Watch your back. Mac didn't respond. He disappeared down the path, leaving Carter standing alone in the clearing. Back at the Iron Talons hangout, a dimly lit garage on the outskirts of town, the gang huddled around Snake's laptop as he typed furiously. The screen displayed a series of databases, some of them clearly not meant for public access. Snake's contact, a shady tech expert known only as Wire, had provided him with a way to dig deeper into Mac's identity. Got him, Snake said triumphantly, leaning back in his chair. The screen displayed a photo of Mac, along with the name, James MacArthur. The file listed basic information: age, address, and a few innocuous details about his quiet life. But what caught Snake's attention was the section labeled Military Service. Special Forces. Razor said, peering over Snake's shoulder. No wonder he took us down like that. Snake's smirk returned. Yeah, but look at this, he's retired. Means he's out of practice. Just an old dog with a few leftover tricks. Bruiser frowned. I don't know, Snake. This guy's dangerous. Maybe we should just let it go. Snake slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. Are you kidding me? Let it go? He humiliated us. We're the Iron Talons. We don't back down from anyone, especially not some washed-up soldier. The room fell silent. Razor glanced nervously at the others but didn't dare voice his doubts. Snake leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a mix of anger and determination. We're gonna make him pay. And we're gonna do it where it hurts most. What's the plan? Razor asked hesitantly. Snake grinned. Simple. We hit him at his home. Tonight. As the sun set over the town, Mac returned to his small, modest house at the edge of the woods. The place was unassuming, much like its owner, neatly kept but without any unnecessary frills. Inside, Mac placed his cane by the door and sank into his recliner, sighing softly. He turned on the old radio, letting the soft strains of a blues tune fill the room. He had a feeling the bikers weren't done with him. Men like that didn't take defeat lightly. But Mac wasn't worried. He'd faced worse in his time, and he knew how to stay one step ahead. In the corner of the room, a locked cabinet stood quietly, its contents untouched for years. But tonight, Mac's gaze lingered on it longer than usual. Mac stood over the groaning leader, Snake, his cane planted firmly on the ground like an exclamation point to the chaos he had unleashed. Around him, the bikers lay scattered, clutching bruised ribs, twisted arms, and battered egos. The hum of crickets in the park seemed deafening in the aftermath of the fight. Snake coughed, trying to regain his breath. We didn't mean anything by it, old man. Just messing around. Mac's lips curved into a faint smirk, though there was no humor in his eyes. Messing around? You call terrorizing families and picking on the vulnerable messing around? Snake tried to push himself up, but Mac's cane pressed lightly on his chest, keeping him pinned. Let me give you some advice, son, Mac said, his voice low and steady. The world isn't as simple as you think. There's always someone stronger, smarter, or faster waiting to knock you down a peg. Today, that was me. Tomorrow could be someone less forgiving. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mac stepped back, letting Snake scramble to his feet. He gestured to the rest of the gang, who were still groaning and struggling to sit upright. Take your boys and get out of here. Don't come back. And if I hear about you bothering anyone else, we'll have another conversation. Only next time, I won't be so nice. Snake looked around at his crew, bruised, beaten, and thoroughly humiliated. His pride told him to fight back, but his body screamed for mercy. Slowly, he nodded, motioning for his gang to gather themselves. Let's go, he muttered, his voice barely audible. The bikers limped away toward their motorcycles, casting wary glances back at Mac, who stood motionless, his cane in hand. As they mounted their bikes, Snake shot Mac one last look, his eyes a mix of fear and resentment. This ain't over, he growled under his breath. Mac didn't flinch. His steely gaze followed them until the roar of their engines faded into the distance. As the park emptied and night began to fall, Mac sat back on the wooden bench. He pulled out a handkerchief and wiped a small cut on his knuckle, the only mark from the scuffle. Despite his calm exterior, his mind churned. He hadn't wanted to fight, but some lines couldn't be crossed, not on his watch. He stared out at the pond, its surface shimmering under the pale moonlight. For a moment, he allowed himself to reflect not just on the fight, but on the years that had led him here. The discipline, the training, the battles that had shaped him into the man he was. He'd tried to leave that life behind, but today had reminded him that some instincts never fade. The sound of footsteps broke his reverie. Mac's grip on his cane tightened, but he relaxed when he saw a familiar face approaching. It was Agent Carter, the man from Homeland Security. He was dressed more casually now, in jeans and a leather jacket, but his sharp, calculating eyes remained the same. You handled that well, Carter said, stopping a few feet away. Mac raised an eyebrow. You were watching. Carter shrugged. I figured you didn't need help. And I was right. Mac leaned back on the bench, studying Carter. What do you want, Agent? Carter's expression grew serious. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, holding it out to Mac. I wasn't just passing through the park today. I was looking for you. Mac frowned but took the envelope. Inside was a photograph, black and white, grainy, and clearly taken from a surveillance camera. It showed a group of men in tactical gear standing around a nondescript warehouse. One of the men wore a patch similar to Mac's. Recognize anyone? Carter asked. Mac's eyes lingered on the photo. His jaw tightened. What's this about? These guys are ghosts, Carter explained. Off the grid. But they're planning something big. I've got reason to believe you know at least one of them. Mac's fingers curled around the photo. Memories he had tried to bury resurfaced, missions in hostile territories, decisions made in the heat of battle, and the faces of those who had fought alongside him. He recognized the man in the photo, even though it had been years since they'd last spoken. What do you want me to do about it? Mac asked, his tone guarded. Carter hesitated before answering. I know you've been out of the game for a while. And I know you didn't ask for this. But we need someone who understands these guys, how they think, how they operate. Someone who can stop them before it's too late. Mac shook his head. I'm retired, Carter. I've done my time. I get it, Carter said, his voice softening. But if you don't step up, who will? These men aren't just threats to the country, they're threats to everything you stand for. Mac didn't respond immediately. He stared at the photo, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to walk away, to leave the past where it belonged. But another part, the soldier, the protector, knew he couldn't turn a blind eye. Finally, Mac folded the photo and tucked it into his pocket. I'll think about it. Carter nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. That's all I ask. As Carter turned to leave, Mac called after him. One more thing. Carter stopped and glanced back. Yeah. Mac's gaze was hard, his voice unwavering. If I do this, I do it my way. Carter grinned. Wouldn't have it any other way. Later that night, Mac returned to his modest home. The moonlight illuminated the small, tidy living room. He walked over to the locked cabinet in the corner and unlocked it for the first time in years. Inside was an array of gear, everything from medals and photographs to a well-maintained set of weapons. He ran his fingers over the worn leather straps of his tactical vest, the weight of old memories settling on his shoulders. Pulling out a knife, he examined its blade, sharp and ready. Just like he would have to be. The bikers had been a wake-up call. The world hadn't gotten any safer, and there were still battles to be fought. Whether he liked it or not, Mac knew one thing for certain: his fight wasn't over. As he closed the cabinet and prepared for what lay ahead, a single thought echoed in his mind. They underestimated the wrong man. Again. The room was still as Mac closed the cabinet. The hum of his old refrigerator in the corner was the only sound breaking the silence. He stood there for a moment, his mind swimming with memories of the past and thoughts of what might come. That photograph, tucked into his jacket pocket, felt heavier than it should, a reminder that no matter how far he had tried to distance himself from the life he once led, it had a way of finding him. He poured himself a cup of coffee, though it was well past midnight, and sat at the small table by the window. Outside, the street was empty, shadows stretching under the dim glow of a street lamp. Mac's fingers drummed lightly on the table as he stared into the darkness, the weight of his decision pressing against him. The man in the photo, Callahan, had been a brother in arms. They'd fought side by side in some of the most dangerous missions during Mac's time in the Rangers. Callahan was sharp, resourceful, and loyal, but he'd always had a streak of rebellion in him. After they both left the military, Callahan had gone dark, vanishing from the grid. Now, seeing him again, and in a photo tied to something as serious as this, left Mac unsettled. The Callahan he knew wouldn't align himself with criminals or terrorists. But people change, and Mac had seen firsthand how circumstances could push even the best men to their breaking point. Mac leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He recalled their last mission together, deep in enemy territory, when Callahan had saved his life. They had been ambushed, outnumbered, and outgunned. Callahan had risked everything to pull Mac from the wreckage of their Humvee, shielding him from enemy fire. That debt weighed heavy on Mac's conscience now. "What happened to you, Cal?" he muttered under his breath. The following morning, Mac stepped out onto his porch, the crisp air carrying the scent of dew-covered grass. He'd barely slept, his mind running scenarios and questions on a loop. As he bent down to pick up the newspaper from the stoop, a flash of movement caught his eye. A black sedan idled at the end of the street, its tinted windows hiding the driver. It didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. Mac's grip tightened on the newspaper as he straightened, his senses immediately on high alert. The car lingered for a moment before pulling away, its engine purring softly as it disappeared around the corner. To the average person, it might have seemed like nothing, but Mac knew better. He had been watched enough in his life to recognize the signs. Someone was keeping tabs on him. He stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. This wasn't just about Callahan anymore. Whoever was behind this operation had already taken notice of Mac's involvement and they were making it clear they knew where to find him. Later that afternoon, as Mac cleaned up his tools in the garage, there was a knock at the door. He wiped his hands on a rag and opened it to find a young woman standing there, looking nervous but determined. She couldn't have been more than 25, with sharp green eyes and a backpack slung over one shoulder. Her posture was stiff, as though she were bracing for a confrontation. "Can I help you?" Mac asked, his tone neutral but cautious. "You're James MacArthur, right?" she asked, her voice steady despite her obvious unease. Mac hesitated before answering. "Depends on who's asking." She pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out to him. "Agent Carter sent me. Said you'd understand." Mac took the paper, unfolding it carefully. Inside was a note in Carter's handwriting, "This is Sam. Trust her. She's one of the good ones." He looked back at the young woman. "Sam, huh? That short for Samantha?" She nodded. "Samantha Hayes. I work with Carter on intel analysis. He thought you might need some backup." Mac raised an eyebrow. "Backup? You don't look like the type to jump into a firefight." Sam's expression hardened. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to make sure you know what you're walking into." Mac studied her for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Over the next hour, Sam spread out maps, photos, and documents across Mac's small dining table. She spoke quickly but clearly, laying out everything she'd uncovered about the group tied to the photo Carter had given Mac. "The warehouse in the picture? It's one of 3 sites we've been monitoring," Sam explained, pointing to a satellite image. "We believe they're stockpiling weapons and materials for something big, but we haven't been able to confirm what." Mac's eyes scanned the images. "And Callahan? What's his role in all this?" Sam hesitated. "That's complicated. From what we've gathered, he's not just a participant. He's one of the leaders." Mac's jaw tightened. "That doesn't make sense. Callahan wouldn't do this." "I hope you're right," Sam said quietly. "But the evidence suggests otherwise. And if we don't act fast, whatever they're planning will be set in motion." Mac leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He didn't want to believe Callahan could be involved in something like this, but the facts were hard to ignore. "What's the timeline?" he asked finally. Sam checked her watch. "We've got 48 hours, maybe less." That night, Mac began preparing. He hadn't suited up in years, but muscle memory kicked in as he donned his old tactical gear. The weight of the Kevlar vest was familiar, almost comforting. He checked his weapons, a pistol, a combat knife, and his trusty cane staff, which he'd modified to include a hidden blade. Sam watched from the corner, her expression a mix of awe and apprehension. "You really were the real deal, weren't you?" she asked. Mac didn't look up. "I didn't sign up for this to impress anyone. I did it because it needed to be done." She nodded, falling silent as Mac finished his preparations. As they loaded their gear into his old pickup truck, Sam asked, "What happens if Callahan really is behind this? Can you take him down?" Mac's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I'll do what I have to." The drive to the warehouse was quiet, the tension between them palpable. Both knew the stakes, and neither wanted to voice the unspoken fears that hung in the air. As the city lights faded behind them, the mission ahead loomed large. Mac's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where a single car had been following them for miles. He didn't mention it to Sam, but his grip on the wheel tightened. Whoever was behind them would learn soon enough that James MacArthur was far from an easy target. 2 park rangers and a pair of police officers stepped out of their vehicles, surveying the scene. The lead ranger, a woman with sharp eyes and a firm stance, approached Mac cautiously. "Sir, We've had reports of an altercation here. Are you all right? Before Mac could answer, a flurry of voices rose from the families gathered nearby. He stopped them, a woman exclaimed, pointing to the group of bikers sprawled on the grass, nursing their injuries. They came here, causing trouble, added an older man. And this gentleman, well, he took care of them. The ranger's eyes narrowed as she turned toward the Iron Talons. The bikers, stripped of their swagger, avoided her gaze. One of them, still clutching his ribs, muttered, "We were just." "Save it," the officer beside her barked. "You can explain yourself at the station." The leader of the gang, still sprawled on the ground, glanced up at Mac, his face a mixture of anger and grudging respect. "You got lucky, old man," he growled, though his voice lacked conviction. Mac tilted his head slightly, meeting the man's gaze. "Luck's got nothing to do with it," he said, his voice steady. "You should have thought twice before picking on people who didn't deserve it." The bikers were hauled to their feet and cuffed one by one, their grumbling drowned out by the applause from the bystanders. As the rangers and officers began their investigation, families and park-goers gathered around Mac. A young father approached, holding his son's hand tightly. The boy, no older than 6, looked up at Mac with wide eyes. "Are you a superhero?" he asked shyly. Mac chuckled, the lines on his face softening. "Just a guy who doesn't like bullies," he replied, tooling the boy's hair. The father extended his hand, and Mac shook it firmly. "Thank you," the man said earnestly. "You didn't have to step in, but you did. You probably saved a lot of people today." Mac shrugged. "It's what we do," he said simply, though the weight of his words hinted at a deeper story. Another woman, her voice trembling with gratitude, said, "I don't know who you are, but we owe you so much. They've been causing trouble around here for weeks." Mac looked around at the faces of the community, young and old, grateful and inspired. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stir within him, a quiet pride that had been buried under years of solitude. Back at the station, the bikers' records were dug up, revealing a laundry list of petty crimes, assaults, and intimidation tactics. The officers assured the families that this time, the Iron Talons wouldn't get off lightly. Witness testimonies poured in, and with Mac's quiet but firm account, their fate was sealed. The gang's leader, slumped in a holding cell, stared at the wall, replaying the encounter in his mind. He'd underestimated the man on the bench, thinking him an easy target. Instead, he'd walked into a storm he couldn't control. The park slowly returned to normal. Children laughed again, chasing each other near the swings. Couples walked hand in hand along the pond. The chaos of the afternoon had faded into the background, leaving behind an unspoken sense of security. Mac remained on his bench, his thoughts miles away. His cane rested against his leg, its hidden strength now a secret shared with only a few. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park. A teenager approached him hesitantly, holding a sketchpad. Excuse me, sir," she said, her cheeks flushed. "Do you mind if I draw you? The way you handled those guys was incredible." Mac raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Go ahead, if you want. But I'm just an old man trying to enjoy the park." As she sketched, Mac's mind wandered to the lessons of his past. He'd spent years in silence, trying to leave behind the man he used to be. But today reminded him that some battles couldn't be ignored. Sometimes, the world needed someone to step up, not because it was easy, but because it was right. As the teenager packed up her sketchpad, a shadow fell over Mac. He looked up to see Agent Carter standing there, hands in his pockets. "Word travels fast," Carter said with a smirk. "I didn't call for backup," Mac replied, though there was no hostility in his voice. Carter shrugged. "Didn't think you'd need it. Just wanted to check in." Mac studied the younger man for a moment before nodding toward the park. They're good people here. Just needed a reminder that someone's watching out for them. Carter nodded, his expression growing serious. You know, the world's a mess these days. People like you are a rare breed. We could use someone like you back on the grid. Mac shook his head. Not my fight anymore. Maybe not, Carter said, pulling a small card from his pocket and placing it on the bench. But if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. As Carter walked away, Mac picked up the card and turned it over in his hands. It was blank except for a single phone number. He slipped it into his jacket pocket, unsure if he'd ever use it. The sun began to set, painting the park in hues of orange and gold. Mac rose from the bench, his legs steady beneath him. He walked slowly toward the pond, pausing to watch the ducks glide across the water. The families who had witnessed the day's events waved at him, their smiles warm and genuine. Mac tipped his hat in response, a small gesture that spoke volumes. As he left the park, his footsteps steady and deliberate, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He may have been retired from the battles of his past, but today reminded him that some fights were worth stepping back into, not for glory, but for the simple act of standing up for what was right. In his quiet way, Mac had become a guardian of the park, a protector of the everyday moments that mattered most. And though the world might never know his name, the people of Franklin Park would remember the day a quiet man on a bench taught a gang of bikers what true strength looked like. Sometimes, justice didn't need a badge or a uniform. Sometimes, it just needed someone willing to act. As the sun began to set, casting warm orange and purple hues across the sky, Mac stood up from the bench, stretching his legs. The park, now returned to its peaceful rhythm, had almost forgotten the chaos that had taken place just hours earlier. The families who had fled in fear now strolled down the walking paths, pushing strollers and chatting casually. Children laughed in the distance, chasing each other around the playground, their carefree voices filling the air once more. Mac looked out over the pond for a moment, the ripples on the water catching the last light of the day. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool evening air. It was as if the park, and the world around it, had been reset to normal, a state of calm after the storm. Yet, Mac knew that things would never be quite the same. People had seen something today. Something they might not have understood completely, but something they would remember. With a wry smile, he shook his head. Not bad for a quiet day at the park, he muttered to himself, his voice low and almost inaudible to anyone nearby. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He hadn't planned for any of it to happen. He hadn't set out to make a statement, and yet, somehow, that's exactly what he had done. Sometimes, heroes didn't need grand gestures. They didn't need to stand on podiums, to be hailed by the crowd, or to wear flashy costumes that screamed for attention. Sometimes, heroes were the ones who sat quietly, in the background, unnoticed by most. They were the ones who observed the world around them, waiting for the right moment to act. And when that moment came, they didn't rush. They didn't panic. They simply did what was needed. No more, no less. Mac was that kind of hero. The kind who didn't seek out praise, didn't care for the recognition. He wasn't a man driven by fame or fortune. He was a man driven by a simple code: protect what matters. To him, that meant standing up when others couldn't, defending the weak when they were too afraid to speak up for themselves. As he walked away from the park bench, his footsteps steady and deliberate, he couldn't help but notice the way people looked at him now. It was subtle, but he saw the shift. There were no more nervous glances or dismissive stares. Now, there was a certain respect in their eyes, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened. It wasn't the kind of respect that came from titles or accolades. It was the respect that came from knowing that a man who seemed quiet and unassuming could, when the moment demanded it, rise to the occasion and do what was right. Mac wasn't interested in being a hero. He wasn't seeking recognition or glory. But the truth was, sometimes the world needed people like him, the ones who were willing to step in when it mattered most, without hesitation, without fanfare. And when that happened, the world would remember. He passed the families who had witnessed the altercation earlier in the day. Some of them gave him a small nod or a smile, their faces warm with gratitude. The little boy who had asked if he was a superhero waved at him from a distance, his wide eyes filled with admiration. Mac gave a small wave back, his lips curling into a faint, quiet smile. The child would grow up with that memory, the image of the old man on the bench standing tall against a gang of bikers, showing everyone that you didn't have to be young, strong, or flashy to make a difference. As he continued down the path, Mac thought about how often people underestimated those who seemed quiet or ordinary. How often people judged others based on what they saw on the surface, never bothering to look deeper. It wasn't just in the park or with the bikers, it was everywhere. In the workplace. In schools. In neighborhoods. People too often assumed that the ones who didn't speak loudly or demand attention had nothing of value to offer. But that wasn't true. And Mac knew it better than most. He had lived a life full of secrets, of struggles, of silent sacrifices. He had walked away from battles that others couldn't even comprehend. And yet, he had learned something crucial along the way: the most important strength didn't lie in how loud you were, or how much you showed off. The true strength lay in your ability to remain calm, focused, and determined when others would have faltered. Mac had been a soldier once, a warrior in a world that demanded precision, skill, and restraint. He had faced the kind of horrors and challenges that most people could never imagine. But even in those dark moments, he had never forgotten the lesson he had learned long ago: true strength came from within. It wasn't about fighting for the sake of fighting. It wasn't about winning at any cost. It was about knowing when to fight, when to stand your ground, and when to walk away. The park was growing quieter now, as the last of the evening joggers made their way home and the families began to pack up their things. The sun had almost disappeared completely behind the horizon, leaving the sky a deep purple, streaked with the last remnants of daylight. The world around him seemed peaceful again, and in that peace, Mac found solace. He glanced back toward the park bench where it had all started. The bench that had been the scene of so much chaos and drama, now a simple, quiet seat under the fading light. He knew that tomorrow, it would likely be just another ordinary day in the park. But for those who had witnessed the events unfold, it would always be remembered as the day when an old man on a bench stood up and reminded them that sometimes, strength comes from the most unexpected places. Mac's smile faded as he walked down the path, but the thought remained with him. The world didn't need more loud voices or flashy displays of power. It needed more quiet strength. More people who were willing to stand up when the moment came, not because they wanted to prove something, but because it was the right thing to do. And as he disappeared into the evening, the park behind him slowly grew still, as though it, too, had learned something important. The world would keep turning, the people would keep living their lives, but for a brief moment, the quiet man on the bench had shown them that sometimes, the most unassuming people were the ones who could change everything. In the end, Mac thought, maybe it wasn't so bad to be underestimated. Because, just like today, it was often those who were overlooked who ended up teaching the world the most valuable lessons. They reminded everyone that appearances could be deceiving, and that true strength didn't always have to shout to be heard. It simply had to show up when it mattered. And that was enough.